everyone. My name is Diana Oreto. I run research and the Global Standards Mapping Initiative at GBBC. We have run a working group on digital identity and privacy. It's my pleasure today to be joined by the co-chairs of that working group, Karen Ottoni from Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust, and ShihYun Chia from VerifyVASP, who will discuss with me our report and the framework we have put together. And we are so grateful for all the contributions of our members across GBBC to the work of safeguarding digital identity, security, and privacy. I will let Karen and ShihYun introduce themselves briefly. Please tell us your role and your main area of focus. So Karen, get us started.
Thank you, Diana. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm Karen Ottoni, and I lead ecosystem and strategic initiatives at LF Decentralized Trust, which is part of the Linux Foundation. Our community focuses on building open source infrastructure for digital assets, identity, interoperability across industries, including privacy as well. Over the past year, I also have the privilege, as Diana mentioned, of co-chairing the digital identity and privacy track in the GSMI report along with ShihYun, working with contributors across the GBBC ecosystem, academia, industry to map how privacy preserving technologies are evolving and what it means for real world adoption. So I'm really excited for today's conversation because it sits right at the intersection of standards, technology, and implementation.
Wonderful. ShihYun, kick us off to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Diana, and thank you, Karen. So my name is ShihYun. I run VerifyVASP. We are a travel rule solution provider. Travel rule, which is otherwise known as FATF Recommendation 16, basically introduces transparency into payments, and for the space that we are in, transfers of virtual assets. So effectively, it takes out the anonymity. It is targeted to take out the anonymity of virtual asset transfers, and basically expose the originator and beneficiaries to both the financial institutions serving these individuals or entities on both sides. So quite immediately, you would kind of connect the dots and up in terms of how digital identity plays a key role into basically, helping the players in this industry to comply with this travel rule, right? So I was very excited, as Karen alluded to co-chair this initiative, this very important initiative that is kind of built on standards as well as setting the stage for the future growth in terms of how the industry, in particular the blockchain and Web3 or Web3 industry, can actually do things better than the TradFi. And I particularly think that this is one key area that it would definitely be a key part of that.
Wonderful. So what is digital identity for Web3? The objective of our work together has been to discuss the role of digital identity in fostering responsible growth of Web3 without compromising on data privacy and security. As decentralized applications like tokenized assets and blockchain-based solutions scale without jurisdictional boundaries, the need for trusted identity frameworks becomes really critical. And throughout our work together, we have emphasized that privacy is meant to safeguard user-centered control over what data users wish to reveal about themselves. And this goes beyond just minimizing the disclosure of personal and sensitive information, because users can actually choose to reveal additional information as it may be beneficial to them. And Web3 points to a future where individuals can have the opportunity to protect themselves against unwanted disclosure of personal data, but also project data about themselves to their advantage, like building a personal brand. So decentralization on which Web3 is built and on which Web3 ecosystems operate is really a tool to accomplish this dual goal. It requires a little bit of rethinking, and especially as innovations like stablecoins, payments, agentic commerce are on the rise, these considerations are really crucial, and I'm really looking forward to unpacking these topics with our two wonderful experts here, ShihYun and Karen, and continue the conversation and hopefully provide resources for the community to continue building and innovating in this really important space. So first, let's talk about privacy by design. And I'll start with Karen. For Web3, privacy is not simply anonymity, but selective contextual disclosure. So if you can tell us what that means, especially in this context, how should we envision privacy by design to make the best possible results? How should privacy by design influence how digital identity systems are designed and governed?
So I think, one of the central points that we emphasized in the GSMI report this year is that privacy in Web3, both from the perspective of individuals and organizations, institutions, should be understood as selective contextual disclosure rather than anonymity, which enables those individuals and organizations to prove claims without exposing unnecessary data. So the report maps across tools like verifiable credentials, decentralized identifiers, zero-knowledge proofs, and other privacy-enhancing technologies. And, last summer, LF Decentralized Trust, we hosted a privacy workshop in focus on financial services, and also more recently at our member summit, a few privacy sessions as well. And so we're seeing this approach being implemented in practice across our ecosystem. I think that's really a privacy by design approach is really the standard that, those in this space are looking to move towards. Some of the examples that I think we're seeing are things like there's the identity stacks themselves, like Hyperledger Aries and AnonCreds in our community that enable credentials to be issued once and then selectively disclosed across various contexts. We also have more recently a new lab called ZKBK that's out of Berkeley, and they are exploring cryptographic building blocks for first-person credentials and trust graphs along with emerging standards. And in these workshops that we've done with financial institutions, the technologists building these things, we see it being emphasized that what we need is a minimal disclosure with accountability and not necessarily anonymity. So I think what we did in this report was highlight that governance is just as important as the technology. Things like issuer assurance, revocation, accountability frameworks, and that's what institutions are focusing on in terms of how to deploy. So it's not that privacy by design is about hiding identity or hiding information so that no one can see it, but enabling the right information to be proven to the right party at the right time.
So well said, Karen. Thank you. I want to say that together we examined with you and ShihYun and the whole group. It was a wonderful journey to go through how digital identity and privacy technologies interact with institutional risk compliance and operational frameworks in digital asset markets. And we looked across decentralized and federated identity models and privacy enhancing technologies and regulatory regimes to identify where identity friction might create real barriers for institutional onboarding, AML, KYC, as ShihYun mentioned, travel rule compliance, market surveillance, etc. So ShihYun, turning to you, the report mapped out a range of privacy tools, protocols, and techniques. And how can zero-knowledge solutions or other minimal disclosure mechanisms, as Karen pointed out, identify solutions across major use cases like financial services, healthcare, and government to enable more trusted interactions? Basically, how does this get real?
Right. So I thought I'd start with a little bit more contextualization in terms of what selective exposure versus anonymity is, right? So when we talk about identity, most people will liken it to bringing our driver's license or passport and exposing it to an institution to say, I am who I am, right? And that is typically the name, my date of birth, and some ID number, right? But in the context of what we're discussing in terms of contextual disclosure versus anonymity, it's about facilitating transactions in the financial space, right? So, for example, without exposing my name and date of birth, which ultimately gets translated to one of two things, right? Am I a sanctioned individual? Right, that's through my name and my date of birth, and or it could be my date of birth tells the institution I'm of a certain age that enables me to do something, right? So that's from the AML space. For example, risk management or credit space, that identity then transposes to, am I a credit risk to that institution, right? So just based on these two examples, whether it's on the AML space or the credit risk space, that ultimately is the end state that we want to get to. And what Karen has very well described very well is those technologies, while preserving the privacy element of not exposing my name, my date of birth, and my ID that can be used for illicit things, it enables institutions to make decisions based on what they see either on a public blockchain in a specific format or as a worldwide, if we had a worldwide standard, a global standard on it, to be able to extract that contextual information without exposing my full identity, right? So if we are able to progress to that, I think the technologies are definitely in place, but it then becomes whether it becomes accepted by the regulators and even the institutions themselves, right? However, I think during the study, it was also raised that these technologies do not come cheap, especially for cryptographic, right? As the compute costs do come down, that also becomes an enabler for the industry to adopt such technologies, in addition to the regulatory adoption or the acknowledgement that such technologies could eventually take over how we visualize identity in these industries.
Those are great points. And we have seen privacy and risk versus risk trade-offs, where it ultimately all points to trust. We have framed privacy in many ways as a quantifiable risk and operational consideration for organizations, which allows them to balance data minimization with auditability and control. And this way, we hope to help bridge tech teams with compliance functions. Karen, turning to you, if you can build on ShihYun's comments, especially clarifying what is the challenge of ZK implementation in production, especially as it relates to trust.
Yeah, well, one thing that I was thinking about when ShihYun was talking was how important open source then is in helping bring those costs down and, create a more, by default use standardization and collaboration on what these frameworks are that can be useful to everybody. So, the implementation is, I think we're kind of, if you look along the course of the last, 10 years in this space, privacy, I think, has always been this big hurdle that people, and along with interoperability too, kind of like, we'll get there. But now we're sort of in front of that mountain, right? And we need to climb it. And I think that there's a lot of really great companies in this space that are addressing it and are showing what can be done even in production. And so the challenge is, though, that I think we have in going into production with privacy technologies, that I hear from a lot of those in our ecosystem is that privacy technologies don't eliminate trust requirements. They just shift where trust is located. And so you still need trust in like credential issuers. You still need trust on for your data provenance, your governance frameworks, the integrity of the implementations. And so institutions consistently emphasize that these sort of issuer assurance frameworks are as important as the cryptography itself, because regulators need these controlled audit pathways even when privacy preserving technologies are used. And so some of those challenges with engineering this is, as we all know, the performance and scalability, right? Zero knowledge has a reputation that it can slow things down. But I think that is, there are innovations happening that address those challenges. Some of the other challenges are the integration complexity, the developer tooling maturity around these technologies. Some of these are very early. They're coming out, of academia, essentially, and may not have all the tooling necessary for it to be, implemented in institutions broadly. And also then the standardization gaps, right? We have a lot of different solutions. And getting back to ShihYun's comment, it's very expensive to try them all out and figure out which one works the best, right? And so there really, I think, does need to be a move towards, more collaboration around standardization. That's part of what we are trying to do at LF Decentralized Trust is bring competing organizations together to talk about these challenges and, what are the things that they can collaborate on to address them as a whole, to knowledge share, to help advance, these privacy technologies further sooner. So some of those, there are some initiatives that are working on that. We have technology and a project at LF Decentralized Trust called Minokawa that was contributed by Shielded Technologies, which explores zero knowledge native smart contract environments that combine the public and confidential logic with auditable guarantees, right? That's what a lot of the regulators are looking for. There's also something else that they contributed called the Nightstream Lab. It's still in our labs, which explores specifically addressing the scalability problem with scalability proving architectures, and also a post-quantum readiness, which is the other mountain further along the road that we're all saying we'll get there, but that will come maybe sooner than we think. So, I think it's not just about performance, although that certainly is one of the bigger challenges, but building this trust infrastructure around the cryptography of implementing zero knowledge in these ways. So zero knowledge is really like the privacy mechanisms, but it's the governance and standards that make it deployable for production use cases.
Absolutely, Karen. And I'm going to take what you say on standards and really shift the conversation that way, because standards are so important. In the report, we mapped out a range of standards for digital identity and how they are relevant for Web3 and Web3 commerce, so that we don't just surface identity-related barriers to adoption, but we've also outlined, as Karen mentioned, actionable frameworks that can help institutions navigate regulatory expectations in a way that also preserves market utility and safeguards information. So Karen, I'm going to turn it back to you to build further on standards and looking ahead. What do you hope we will achieve in the domain of digital identity and privacy, both in standards and in implementation over the next 3 or 5 years? What does the future look like with standards?
I think that our goal at LF Decentralized Trust is to help with the convening. So help bringing different parties together to have those conversations. So sorry for kind of queuing up the answer earlier.
Yeah, I love your excitement. It's so important.
I think that's our main goals. I think we do need to bring people together. There's a little bit of fragmentation here now. A lot of different people with a lot of different solutions, and that slows adoption because institutions are like, I don't know who to pick. I can't pick a winner, or and so I think we do need to have these avenues for that sort of collaboration. In terms of what we discuss in the report, that sort of fragmentation was brought up as one of the major barriers to adoption. And so I hope that the report helps address that as well, that we start to see avenues for those kinds of standardization efforts. I think that also, one thing that will also help is just bringing about emerging use cases. I think that there aren't enough well-known public examples of this being done in production. And so that's something that we are working towards too, is to identify, with the technologies that we have within our ecosystem, how can we share so that we show others what's possible, what the successes are, what maybe the challenges are, and bring about more adoption and examples through that. In terms of the standards themselves, I think it comes back to not just the technologies themselves like zero knowledge, but those frameworks, those governance frameworks. Also, we need to kind of converge around that. So, interoperable credential formats, these shared assurance frameworks, privacy preserving compliance patterns. How do we port these things across different ecosystems? So there's it's very complex. And I think we're seeing those building blocks emerge. We have a community, Trust Over IP, that's working on a lot of these identity frameworks, focus on interoperability as well. But standards emerge in various different ways. There's the formal standards body that's very top down. Maybe we'll see efforts there, but what I really see happening mostly in this industry is more of a bottom-up organic thing where it's, different working groups coming together, different types of convening at whether it be like a conference or within our community, working group within our community or GBBC, for example. That's where I see the standards kind of emerging, in such a fast moving space. I think that there's a lot of work to be done. Especially with making this smooth in terms of onboarding and the experience, both on a user or organizational level. But I think, what we really need to focus on in terms of the next 3 to 5 years is, doing some of that converging around common patterns and portability across different trust systems.
That is so true. And as we've identified gaps and opportunities for interoperable identity standards, that is key for scale across markets and borders. And that's also a key concern for global operations, especially as we move toward institutional and scale and growth. Turning to ShihYun, what are your predictions for standards development in the realm of privacy-preserving digital identity, and what are the key enablers to get there?
Right. Again, I like to start at the 30,000 foot, from my simplistic mind at least. What's the problem statement? Karen hit the nail on the head. Fragmentation. And how do you solve for fragmentation? Frameworks within which standards exist. Right. So if everyone follows that standard and then which is ultimately part of a bigger framework, then eventually everybody will be headed in hopefully the right direction as to what digital identity should look like. But fragmentation still exists. It exists across blockchains. It exists across regulations. It exists across industries. It exists across everything, right? And because of that, I think what GBBC is doing alongside with all the other worldwide standard setting groups like ISO, that probably helps kind of define what the framework is. But I like to go back to what Karen said about the bottoms up approach, right? How do we, as an industry within this blockchain or Web3 industry, identify use cases and have small wins to prove that the framework is leading the industry in the right direction, right? So hopefully, I think we've covered some of that in coming up with this paper. We've covered some of the mappings. We've covered some of the frameworks, what frameworks could look like if we could kind of extend it and identify use cases, or rather, let's not boil the ocean and say we'll fix it all in one shot. Rather, let's identify small use cases, have small wins against them, to all the initiatives that the LDF is doing, totally on board with that. I would love to be part of some of those initiatives as well. All right. And to the extent that we get something moving, and basically have a real world use case that is solved, and that becomes a small win that we then pitch to the rest of the industry. Right.
Mhm.
I think, Karen mentioned earlier, the working group for this paper, in coming up with this paper, also comprised of academics, right? And the fact that we had academics in there, it kind of reinforces the theoretical thought process that was put into this paper against the industry participants, to basically kind of converge those thought processes into coming up with this paper. And hope I'm quite optimistic that probably within 3 to 5 years we will have these small wins. Will we solve everything? No, but at least we should get the industry facing the right direction, or at least started moving in the right direction.
I love to hear this. And so far, I'm hearing the role of trust, the role of real-world examples as testimonies of how this works, the role of frameworks and ways of bringing communities together to agree on and implement standards in harmonized and coordinated ways. So going back to ShihYun and building on what you say, why should identity and privacy be considered foundational infrastructure for scalable Web3 adoption across real-world examples in finance, governance, healthcare, and beyond?
Right. I mean, the very basic answer to this question is identity drives everything. I kind of alluded to that in my earlier response, in terms of driving transactions, right? In the financial industry, whether it's AML related decisions or credit risk related. In healthcare, for example, right? If I go to a hospital, I do not need the hospital should immediately pull up, I'm a DNR, for example, do not resuscitate, right? That is again a decision that the hospital needs to take on the basis of a contextual exposure of my identity, right? So if you look across all of these examples, whether it's financial, whether it's healthcare, whether it's insurance, at the center of it all is your identity. Without this identity, there would be friction, right? Imagine if I'm on the hospital bed and let's say I have an allergy. Again, if the allergy is not exposed through my digital identity or some form, there will be friction in terms of administering the right healthcare to me. The same issues on the financial side, right? So with all these examples, I hope I've articulated how the importance of identity, not necessarily my name, my ID number, my date of birth, but rather the selected exposure in the context of which an institution needs to make a decision against that is based on, right?
Mhm.
And that is why that building block, if we can put this building block of the identity on a public blockchain, which is accessible for all, that is peer validated or even CKP, that could potentially have exponentially more benefits than when we went to the hospitals like last time and they had to look through for our records on the cards, for example, right? So that's it. I wish I could have put it in a theoretical form, but I hope I answered the question through examples adequately.
No, absolutely. That's what we need most. And as we unfortunately bring our discussion to a close, I'm going to ask you both for a key takeaway. Karen and from ShihYun, how will the future of digital identity and privacy change the way we interact online, especially commercial activity? In one brief sentence each. Let's start with Karen.
Ooh, one brief sentence.
If you can.
It's a miracle we haven't mentioned AI in this conversation. But I think, with that wave now underway, it is, identity is really critical. Even, it was critical before, and now it's extremely critical because we need to be able to identify whether you're human or not, et cetera. And who can act on your behalf. So I think there's going to be there was already going to be a lot of interesting work around identity and privacy as a way to unlock a lot of these use cases that we want to do in Web3 on a scale at the institutional level that I think is very exciting. And that's even more so important with AI. So I don't know if I can predict anything, but I know what we need, and I think that's what we've been talking about, ShihYun and I, throughout this conversation. We need standards, we need collaboration, we need convening, we need common patterns and frameworks and governance. And I think if we can come together and hone that in on a few key use cases as examples, then I think we have a really good way forward.
So well said. Once again. ShihYun, what's your prediction on the future of digital identity and privacy?
I think we see it in the movies already, where a probative feature, whether it's my face or I have a QR code that's tattooed onto my wrist, that identifies me, and I can do any transaction just based on these probative features, and immediately it references some public blockchain that exposes what feature of my identity that transaction requires, and automatically downloads it. Right, so it's a bit sci-fi type of future prediction. I hope I would be able to see it within my lifetime, but fingers
We're getting
crossed.
there. We're already there in many ways.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much once again to Karen and ShihYun. It's been a pleasure to work with you, and I truly look forward to following your continued work ahead as brilliant examples of how this can be deployed in the right way.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure working with you, ShihYun and Diana, and thank you to GBBC for for supporting these sorts of reports that I think the industry really needs. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.